When I was growing up, our house had a long, narrow lot, roughly an acre in size. I was responsible for mowing, which needed several hours each Saturday from March through November. Most of the yard was flat and grassy, taking more time than effort to tend, but on either side grew what had become the bane of my existence. Toward the back on the west was a small patch of blackberry brambles leaning in from beside a neighbor's shed. On the east side, the entire fence line was overgrown with a thick, prolific vine, which I assumed was related to the ivy that loved to climb the walls of our brick house. I felt like nature was constantly allied against me with this two-front invasion. The vines especially frustrated me. They seemed determined to consume everything: bushes, trees, even the lawn itself. I battled their constantly creeping tendrils throughout junior high and high school, struggling to untangle them from their chain-link trellis, carefully tracing each branch farther and farther back in hopes of finally striking a fatal blow to the whole plant. It was largely futile, since the fence was topped with barbed wire and the root turned out to be hidden on the neighbor's lot. But I did my best. Once I finally had that eastern front somewhat under control, I turned my attention to the overgrown blackberries. Emerging from our basement armed with a large pair of snips and some very thick leather gloves, I vowed that the brambles would never scratch me up again. I even went so far as to stretch under the fence onto the neighbor's property to chop them all off, all the way down at the base. Thorns finally out of sight and mystery vines tentatively at bay, mowing became much easier, and I really didn't give much more thought to either for the rest of the year. In today's gospel reading, we join Jesus and his followers shortly after the Last Supper. Judas had already left to initiate his betrayal, and as the remaining disciples make their way toward the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus summarizes what he most wants them to remember, which is his command to agape, to love one another, not just in their hearts or by offering thoughts and prayers, but through genuine physical action. Over this and the past few Sundays, you may have noticed the frequent repetition of one of John's favorite words: abide. It's been showing up in both our gospel and epistle readings for several weeks now. For me, the concept of behind abiding has a sort of passive quality. It conjures up these images of waiting for a bus, or more positively, settling into one's home each evening. There's a certain sense of commonality or even boredom to it. But the way that Jesus uses it, abide is far less static than the images that naturally come to mind. Just as John's love is more of an activity than a mental state, so abide requires significantly more effort than simply becoming comfortable in one's neighborhood or leaning into the psalmist's famous adage to be still and know. Abiding does indeed involve staying put, but the way Jesus is using it, it isn't static. This is a word of intention and commitment, associated more with military occupation or settling a frontier than simply becoming comfortable in one's own neighborhood. It carries the idea of embedding oneself, of standing your ground or struggling to maintain a position, not simply dwelling somewhere in uninterrupted tranquility. In the context of looming betrayal and crucifixion, Jesus is likely using it more along the lines of stick to than what we expect from abide in. You all stick to me, and I'll stick with you. Compounding the active nature of abiding, The branches are showing a surprising amount of other initiative here. Biblical Greek uses two words for negation. One is objective, a statement of fact, like where Jesus says, a branch cannot bear fruit by itself. End of story. No root, no fruit. It's simply not possible. Now, it doesn't show up very well in English, but when he continues with, unless it abides in the vine, he's using the other term, which is subjective. A subjective negative suggests not simple fact, but includes an element of perception or volition. So the branch doesn't seem to be limited by some sort of outside factor here. It's not that it simply doesn't or can't bear fruit. It isn't necessarily weakened by disease, nor is it innately infertile. The way Jesus is talking, the branch won't grow any grapes. It's actively refusing. So imagine a branch emerging from its root. As the root feeds it, the branch naturally grows farther and farther away from the trunk of the vine. It matures and starts sending out its own tendrils, its leaves partnering with those elsewhere to feed the entirety of the plant, the root included. Everything is growing in harmony, branches and leaves, root and grapes. Energy is active and flowing throughout it, but the appearance is completely effortless. A healthy exchange whose benefits extend beyond the plant to the world around it. However, at some point, we come to a branch that forgets about anything other than itself and turns from the cooperative nature of production into simple consumption. Going back to my old yard, I was neither surprised nor too concerned when the blackberries began tentatively reaching over the fence again the following spring. Part of why I had put up with the brambles for several years was that I was enjoying eating what little I could collect from their sparse array of tiny fruit. That summer, however, these recently tamed vines surprised me, practically erupting with blackberries. They were juicy and rich and well worth any scratches it took to gather them. My hack job must have somehow relieved the root of the need to feed an excess of old woody vines. So the plant put its restored energy toward growing a quality crop instead. That fall, I saw the same thing happening along the fence across the yard. In fact, that's when I discovered that those long-hated vines were, in fact, grapes. I had never seen a trace of fruit on them before, but now I could actually watch the clusters ripening as I would tend the yard. Being wild, they weren't exactly tasty, but I felt far less malice toward this plant once I realized that it did indeed have a purpose beyond clogging the mower and overrunning our lawn. There's no question that those old vines had become a waste. As extensive and heavy as they had grown, they became presumptive about the root, treating it more like a slave than their source of life. It generously continued to send water and nutrients, but they spent all of that energy on themselves, making their particular branch as large and expansive as possible. I genuinely don't know if those old branches had been or were even still capable of producing fruit. If so, it was very well hidden. Once pruned, however, the branches seemed to remember why they had existed in the first place: to grow grapes that birds and animals would carry away in their stomachs so the seeds could establish themselves in places where the original vine simply couldn't reach. And so with us. Like plants, we grow and spread and produce fruit and sometimes harden ourselves off, becoming woody and stiff, focusing either on reanimating the glories of the past or enforcing our own agenda to the point where we become inflexible and even begin to choke off what little life still flows through us. But it is possible to cut back, to return to the root. I think of one of our locally native plants, the sacred datura. During the summer, it's a bush with broad leaves and large white flowers. You can actually see several beginning to grow beside the road to Dripping Springs right now. But as winter comes, the branches all begin to shrivel and die. By spring, there's often no sign that the plant had ever existed. Yet the root is still there, and it's still alive. As the weather warms and water once again streams over it, the datura bursts from the ground, once again regrowing and rebuilding back into a full bush. A miraculous cycle that repeats itself year after year. Life is made of challenges, things that cut us down or cause us to shrivel to the point where everyone might think that we're dead. Sometimes those are external and well beyond our control. Sometimes, even if we don't like to admit it, we do them to ourselves. Life always involves change, and attempting to prevent natural cycles only prolongs pain. But our life is in the root. When we stick to the root, when we turn to Christ as our primary focus, example, and guide, no matter how difficult things get, life will eventually flow. So even in the midst of pruning, in seasons of loss and defeat, we trust that although everyone else assumes that we're dead and gone, although there might not be any sign that we had ever existed, the life is still in the root. And with our connection to Christ restored, we will rise again. Amen.